Дорогі українці, українки, повертаємось додому. Як підсумок цих днів, чітка підтримка Європи.
Dear Ukrainians, we are returning home. As a result of these days, there is clear support from Europe, even greater unity, even stronger readiness for cooperation. Everyone is united on the main point. For peace to be real, real security guarantees are needed, and this is the position of all of our Europe, of the entire continent, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Norway, Turkey. Today, we coordinated our positions. There will be many meetings and joint efforts in the coming days and weeks. There will be diplomacy for peace. And for the sake of all of us standing together, Ukraine, the whole of Europe, and necessarily America. Of course, we understand the importance of America, and we are grateful for all the support we have received from the United States. There hasn't been a single day when we haven't felt grateful, because this is gratitude for the preservation of our independence. Our resilience in Ukraine is built upon what our partners do for us and for their own security. We need peace, not endless war. And that is why we say that security guarantees are the key to this. In the near future, all of us in Europe will shape our common positions, the lines we must achieve and the lines we cannot compromise on. These positions will be presented to our partners in the United States. Robust and lasting peace and the right agreement on the end of the war are truly our shared priority. And of course, I want to thank you, all of you, everyone in our beloved Ukraine who feels how much unity matters and how history changes when millions defend the dignity of their country. Our warriors on the front line, all our people, I am proud of you. I want to thank all of you. Thank you very much. Glory to Ukraine.
Дуже дякую вам. Слава Україні!
Drone attack on Ufa oil refinery. At first, Ufa residents reported a powerful explosion in the city. Later, firefighters confirmed that a fire had broken out at the refinery, but did not give the cause. Ufa is one of the largest oil refining centers in Russia. In terms of total refining volumes, the Bashkortostan region is among the top 5 oil refining centers in the country. The Ufa oil refinery is located about 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine. Canada has announced new sanctions against Russia. This was said by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during a summit in London. The sanctions have been expanded against 10 individuals and 21 entities, including paramilitary organizations and their leaders, to help counter Russia's use of third-party organizations and countries to advance its political and military goals in Ukraine. To date, Canada has imposed sanctions against more than 3,000 individuals and entities involved in Russian aggression. US President Donald Trump will hold a meeting on Monday with representatives of his administration responsible for defense and security, dedicated to policy towards Ukraine. This is reported by the New York Times, citing an unnamed administration representative. Meeting will be attended in particular by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. According to the publication, the cancellation of military aid to Ukraine, including the supply of ammunition and equipment approved due the Joe Biden administration, will be discussed. The United Kingdom has declared its readiness to deploy ground forces and aircraft to Ukraine if a ceasefire is reached. During a joint press conference with US President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated that, in his view, this is the only way to secure lasting peace.
The UK is ready to put troops on the ground and planes in the air to support a deal, working together with our allies, because it's the only way the peace will last. We must do the right thing. There can be no peace that rewards the aggressor. History must be on the side of the peacemaker, not the invader. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Meanwhile, Ireland and Switzerland have also expressed their readiness to send troops to Ukraine. In addition, the Baltic and Nordic countries, as well as Germany and France, have agreed to contribute forces.
There is a general agreement that in order to guarantee the ceasefire, it will be necessary to have European troops in Ukraine, and UK, Germany and France are already willing to do that, but other member states of the European Union will contribute as well. those troops will arrive after the ceasefire in order to guarantee that ceasefire is respected. But if we want this fire to be respected, we need a US backup.
However, the US appears unlikely to guarantee military support for potential British peacekeeping forces in Ukraine in the event of renewed Russian aggression. According to Donald Trump, the UK troops in Ukraine will be able to take care of themselves. During the press conference, Prime Minister Starmer also announced that representatives from 18 European countries will gather in London to discuss, among other topics, a peace agreement for Ukraine. According to UK Prime Minister's office, the summit will build on the results of two emergency meetings held in Paris in mid-February, organized by French President Emmanuel Macron.
The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is using the summit to advance European action on Ukraine, signaling our collective and unwavering support for securing a just and lasting peace and a long-term agreement that ensures Ukraine's future sovereignty and security. From a report by the UK Prime Minister's office, AFP reports.
The upcoming extraordinary European Union summit on March 6 will also serve as a platform to discuss a potential peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to represent Ukraine at the summit.
It is therefore important for us to exchange on how to further support Ukraine and on the principles that should be respected going forward. The EU and its member states are ready to take more responsibility for Europe's security. We should therefore be prepared for a possible European contribution to the security guarantees that will be necessary to ensure a lasting peace in Ukraine. From the invitation letter from European Council President Antonio Costa to summit participants.
The governments of the UK and France are working on a plan to deploy up to 30,000 soldiers in Ukraine. However, such a number is insufficient, according to Roman Kostenko, Secretary of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence. Ukraine is currently negotiating with partner countries to ensure that any future military contingent overseeing a potential ceasefire is not limited to protecting key infrastructure, but also patrols Ukraine's airspace and maritime zones.
We believe that if our partners and allies are discussing the possible deployment of these contingents to ensure long-term peace and security in Ukraine, it is entirely reasonable to also consider protecting Ukrainian airspace, particularly through patrols by our allies' aircraft.
Additionally, a spokesperson from Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs highlighted the need for an enhanced presence in the Black Sea, given that, according to Ukrainian authorities, Russia has not abandoned its intentions to disrupt freedom of navigation. Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Valeria Nikopelova, UATV News.
Dear friends, I'm Operator Starsky, and this is day 1104 of Russia's illegal and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. What on earth has happened in the Oval Office? Did the White House align with Kremlin? Ukrainian drones hit Russian targets 1,400 kilometers away, and Europe unites against Russian terrorism. My dear friends, this is the Frontline Focus. Let's roll. Obviously, Russian officials are attempting to undermine the proposed mineral agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov suggested that such a deal would not benefit Ukraine, and he also implied that Russia could offer the US a more favorable arrangement. Internationally wanted war criminal Vladimir Putin also highlighted Russia's vast reserves of rare earth materials, indicating willingness to collaborate with the US in this sector. It is worth mentioning that Russian state media is strategically timing the release of certain Kremlin statements to exploit shifts in the US-Ukrainian relations. For instance, comments by Peskov on 26th of February regarding US foreign policy changes aligning with Russia's views were all reported by major Russian outlets on 2nd of March. To understand why, we should take a look at what's happening on the front line, because on the 2nd of March, Russian terrorists continued offensive operations in the Kupiansk direction, but they did not advance, even despite bringing several tanks and using the multiple launch rocket system fire to support their advance. The failed Russian offensive was also confirmed by the Ukrainian military on the ground. As a summary, we can see that Russia is actively working to counter the US-Ukraine collaborations, particularly in the mineral sector, while its military efforts in Ukraine face challenges. Tonight, a Russian kamikaze drone hit an apartment building in Kharkiv during a Russian strike on civilian infrastructure. We know that 8 people were killed or wounded due to this attack, including a 7-year-old. Also tonight, one of the biggest Russian oil refineries, Bashneft, in the city of Ufa, was visited by good Ukrainian drones. The refinery is located 1,400 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border, which is absolutely impressive. This refinery is known for producing 60 different products, including all sorts of fuel for the Russian military. In total, there's 3 Bashneft refineries in Ufa with the combined annual processing capability of about 24 million tons of crude oil. How do you think can Russia protect all their refineries from good Ukrainian drones? Please let me know if you think it's possible. Now, before switching to this disgraceful event that took place in the White House the other day, let me remind you about this one.
And I want to ask you a very simple question tonight. Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop.
Now, let's talk about what is wrong with the US communications and what can be improved. Over the past couple of weeks, I've seen a lot of people trying to find a complex explanation to a simple question: why American President Trump is so aggressive towards Ukraine in his rhetorics. Why does he attack Ukrainians at the same time endorsing invader and war criminal Putin as a good guy who wants peace for his people? Before speaking about why, let's talk about what as far as communications. At this point, the main narrative employed by the White House based on their communication is that Donald Trump doesn't seek victory for Ukraine because he doesn't consider Putin as an aggressor. For example, in his recent post, Donald Trump called to worry less about Putin, and generally in all his previous publications he referred to Putin as a good guy. We can say a really strong policy as far as the US communications that American officials are forbidden to call Putin an aggressor, which can be clearly seen, for example, in the US proposed resolution in the United Nations, or, for example, during the hearings in the Senate.
Mr. Feinberg, did Russia invade Ukraine?
Well, going to my behind closed doors statement a second ago, I'll just say this.
And generally, the reason Donald Trump and J.D. Vance even started attacking President Zelensky in the Oval Office was literally to shut him up. Personally, to me, it seemed as if they didn't want the words about Putin's war crimes to be spoken in front of the US media, which, by the way, not all came from the United States, because we know that Russian media were also invited. At this point, it's obvious that the idea of helping Ukraine win the war is completely unacceptable in the White House, and the deal itself was not about helping Ukraine win. It was only about the return of investment. However, let's be honest, there is absolutely no better way to return investment spent on Ukraine's defense than force the Russian war criminals to pay for their crimes. And that would not only bring back the money invested in Ukraine's defense, but also reinforce collective security and remove the Russian terrorist threat forever. Considering Lavrov's statement that Russia will not be forced to stop its aggression against Ukraine, plus all the cases of Russia violating the ceasefire before 2022, it is absolutely pointless to even try talking them out of war. On the other hand, helping them lose the war is absolutely essential. How can we achieve this? First of all kinds of experts anticipate that Russia will face financial crisis within the next year if current dynamic at the front line is preserved. Boosting the trade with Russia will only prolong the war, while choking the Russian aggressor economically and providing more support to the Ukrainian defenders will accelerate the collapse of the Russian aggression. It's a fact that today Russia is running out of resources for its war. That is why they need Ukraine to be forced into negotiations as soon as possible. And that is why they communicate this through their channels and different influencers. For example, like Tucker Carlson, who already went to Russia twice to deliver their narratives to the Western audience, but for some reason, not vice versa. But despite the aggressive policy of the Trump administration towards Ukraine, President Zelensky announced that he still relies on the US-Ukraine cooperation and is ready to sign the mineral deal if Trump invites him for a constructive dialogue. However, Marco Rubio stated that Ukraine will only be invited when it's ready for peace. What does Marco Rubio mean when he says peace? According to Steve Witkoff, the peace they're talking about is basically the act of Ukraine's capitulation offered by Russians in Istanbul in 2022. At this point, this is the only solution that is acceptable to the Trump administration, and we have never heard about any other peace plan besides this one. In the meantime, Europe is getting more and more consolidated around improving their defenses and supporting Ukraine. During the summit in London, the European leaders came up with three key outcomes. First of all, French President Macron and British Prime Minister Starmer proposed a one-month truce between Ukraine and Russia. The initial truce would not cover ground fighting, though, due to the monitoring challenges along the extensive front line. Also, European leaders emphasized the need to improve defense expenditures in response to Russia's militarization. Macron suggested that Europe defense spending should reach 3 or 3.5% of GDP. In addition to this, Prime Minister Starmer announced the creation of a coalition to support Ukraine, involving significant financial loans and military aid, including air defense missiles. Because if the military defense supplies stop coming to Ukraine from the US, Ukrainian citizens will face increased challenges of being hit by the Russian ballistic missiles, which, as we know, are broadly used by the Russian terrorists to strike power plants, heating stations, and hospitals. That is why the UK announced providing Ukraine with 5,000 missiles to fight Russian Shahed drones, as well as the missile launchers. And if you're watching this, make sure to leave your thumbs up in the comments for the amazing people of the UK, because these missiles will be extremely important to save Ukrainian lives. Dear friends, despite the uneasy situation, I wish you all a beautiful day. Please subscribe to stay informed about the most important updates and share this content to help Ukraine be heard. I'll see you in the commentaries. I'm Operator Starsky. As always, be safe.
In a significant boost to Ukraine's defense and economic resilience, the United Kingdom has pledged a $2.8 billion loan to Kyiv, backed by frozen Russian assets. The agreement, signed on March the 1st during Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to London, reinforces Britain's commitment to Ukraine's security and sovereignty. The loan is part of the G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, or ERA, which aims to provide nearly $50 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine. The US remains the largest contributor, offering $20 billion, followed by European Union nations such as France, Germany, and Italy, which have jointly pledged $19.4 billion. Additional funds will come from Canada, Japan, and the UK.
Minister Marchenko, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to sign the UK-Ukrainian Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan Agreement worth £2.26 billion as part of our unwavering and ongoing support for the Ukrainian people.
And this agreement is very necessary, and because it can cover our military expenses, indirectly targeted specific weapons. And we are so grateful, and I believe that's the first step towards fully seizure of all Russian assets. I believe it will be possible in the nearest future.
Ukraine's finance minister Serhiy Marchenko emphasized that this financial support will be used to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reaffirmed Britain's unwavering support, stating that we stand with Ukraine for as long as it may take. This agreement follows a historic 100-year partnership deal between Kyiv and London, signed earlier this year, covering cooperation in defense, energy, science and trade. The announcement coincides with rising tensions between Zelensky and US President Donald Trump after a contentious meeting in Washington on February 28. As Ukraine continues to seek military and economic backing from its allies, this UK loan underscores the global resolve to counter Russian aggression from a reaction from European partners of Ukraine, while the White House seems to have abandoned the Ukraine support topic entirely. And as the war continues, diplomatic efforts are intensifying to secure a just and lasting peace, as many world leaders state. The UK, France and Ukraine have initiated discussions to draft a ceasefire plan which will be presented to the United States. This effort, led by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, follows a heated Oval Office exchange between Zelensky and Trump. While there is certainly no trust in Europe towards Moscow, just think about it, Russians could just leave Ukraine and end the war in a single day. But they don't do it. They demand surrender of 4 entire regions of Ukraine right now and no visible peace agreement. Their goals remain unchanged. As many people continue to declare, even the Kremlin itself declares that complete demilitarization and a pro-Russian government in the end is the goal of the operation, which is, to be honest, an unconditional surrender from the Ukrainian side, capitulation. After 3 years of fierce fighting and resistance, they just want to secure their victory diplomatically, in inverted commas, of course. During a BBC interview on March 2nd, Starmer underscored the importance of ensuring any ceasefire agreement is both durable and enforceable. President Zelensky is rightly concerned that there is to be a deal it has to hold. That's why we've talked extensively about what the guarantees will be, Starmer explained. The UK and France have been at the forefront of discussions to deploy European peacekeepers in Ukraine to monitor and uphold any ceasefire agreement. While European leaders continue to support us diplomatically and militarily, the Trump administration has signaled that it expects Europe to take the lead in securing Ukraine's future. We cannot exclude the threat of complete retreat of American forces from Europe, as the idea to leave NATO and the UN is mainstreamed by Elon Musk on the X social network. Despite ongoing tensions with Washington, European allies remain steadfast in their support for Ukraine. Starmer has urged both Zelensky and Trump to find common ground, emphasizing that maintaining strong Ukraine-US relations is critical for achieving lasting peace.
Afternoon. The first priority of this government, of any government, first, we will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. Second, we agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. Third, in the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. Fourth, we will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine.
As diplomatic talks progress, Ukraine continues to balance military strategy with political negotiations, ensuring that any agreement aligns with its national security interests and long-term stability. I will not joke about Ukraine developing nuclear weapons after the scandal in the White House, but as we go into the uncertainty, for most world countries, only the nuclear arsenal can really guarantee that other countries will not try to invade them. As alliances deteriorate and no one really knows if they can rely on their allies anymore. We are witnessing right now a reboot of the world order, the new time if you'd like to call it. In this new time, Europe can rely more on itself and on Ukraine for defending the eastern frontier, which is far from being safe, as the Baltic states together with Poland are now already gathering funds to fortify the entire border with Belarus. Yeah, that's right. The security landscape of Europe is shifting dramatically. As Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine drags into its fourth year, peace discussions are beginning without a clear roadmap for Ukraine's or Europe's role in ensuring stability. If Europe is to secure lasting peace on the continent, it will have to take full responsibility for its own defense, starting with Ukraine. The outcome of these peace discussions will be dictated by conditions on the ground. Russia has no incentive to uphold agreements unless it faces decisive military pressure. Even if a settlement is reached, Europe will remain vulnerable to future Russian aggression without a credible deterrence strategy. The best way to secure lasting peace is to empower Ukraine to win the war on its own terms and to ensure its security once victory is achieved. Then to build a sturdy European defense line all over the eastern flank of NATO, or maybe another regional defense alliance, as French Prime Minister François Bayrou has hinted in his recent interview for Le Figaro. France, since the time of General Charles de Gaulle, was right to consider independence as the only guarantee of security, including for Europe, Bayrou said. He also suggested that defense spending should be excluded from European budget deficit rules if we want that very defense to be set effectively, not commercially. Despite support from North Korea and Iran, Russia has failed to achieve any major strategic victories in Ukraine for 3 years of the frontline war straight. It has suffered significant losses, estimated at 850,000. Economic pressures are mounting, with interest rates spiking to 20% and inflation hitting more than 10%. Despite dedicating nearly 41% of its budget to defense, Russia's artillery advantage has shrunk from 10 to 1 in 2022 to just 1.5 to 1. The Kremlin's unsustainable manpower and equipment losses suggest that Russia is nearing a breaking point at this moment. The Ukrainian energy grid managed to sustain 3 winters of missile and drone attacks. Yes, without direct US funding for rebuilding the infrastructure, it will be harder. But we've already been there in 2022 when Ukraine faced the aggressor one-on-one, and only later on the Allies turned in. And in 2022 we did not have domestic missiles and thousands of long-range drones that could create an energy sales crisis in Russia itself, with regular oil refineries setting on fire. A very painful strategy, as most of the profits that Russia still makes despite sanctions is oil trade. In contrast, Western nations possess overwhelming economic superiority. The combined GDP of Ukraine partners was nearly $70 trillion in 2094, compared to Russia's mere $2 trillion. NATO's European members alone have over 10 times Russia's economic output, yet Russia has outspent the West in its efforts to destroy Ukraine, investing 40% more in its war effort than the West has provided in defensive aid to Ukraine. For Europe to remain a serious geopolitical player, it must commit to its own security by backing Ukraine now. This is not just an act of solidarity, it is a matter of self-preservation. Ukraine is part of Europe, and defending it strengthens the entire continent. Recent emergency meetings in Paris and London suggest that European leaders are beginning to grasp the urgency, but the question remains, will they do enough? Research from the Tony Blair Institute suggests that an additional $40 billion annually, just 0.2% of European GDP, would match Russia's war spending and give Ukraine a decisive edge on the battlefield. This sum is negligible compared to past financial interventions, such as responses to the 2008 global financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic. More importantly, it is far cheaper than the alternative: a prolonged Cold War, or worse, an outright war on European soil. Meaningful investment in Ukraine must be paired with firm and enforceable security guarantees and reforms in our country to battle corruption, which is present in any system of the world, no matter what some people might believe. But beyond commitments on paper, Europe must scale up its defense production. Wars are fought on the battlefield, but they are won in factories. Ukraine's defense industry has mobilized faster than any other in Europe. By following Denmark's model, procuring equipment directly from Ukrainian manufacturers for Ukrainian forces, Europe can ramp up production efficiently while learning from Ukraine's battle-hardened experience and do it real fast. And as Ursula von der Leyen has said in London, Europe must immediately rearm itself and prepare for everything. A clear choice: secure Europe is secure Ukraine. All wars eventually end, and all things are temporary in this world. How this war ends will determine whether it restarts in the future. To prevent future conflicts, Europe must proactively invest in its security, and that begins with robust support for our country. This is one of those rare moments in history where the strategic and moral imperatives align. Europe must recognize the difference between right and wrong at this moment and act accordingly. And I believe it will. It was Pavlo Starmer for the Daily Wrap-Up. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel to support us while we deliver the news of the free world to you directly from Ukraine. Greetings, Mr. Jason. You are a friend of our UATV channel and a political expert with great expertise. And for today's interview, I would like to inquire, what the hell is going on in the world right now with the United States, the new world, really, that we all wake up today?
Well, it is certainly a very new world from what it was just a little while ago. At the same time, I think that there's a lot going on, and it's very hard to digest all of it at once because there's a lot of moving pieces. Obviously, what's gone on with Trump and the White House, with Zelensky, the news. But there's been a lot of things that happened since then. We've seen that Europe's become much more united about supporting Ukraine. We've seen that the British are taking a much stronger role than what they had historically, though they've done a great job this entire war, of course. And what's coming ahead? Macron is following through with what he promised, which is that France would play a central role in trying to assist Ukraine. So that there's a lot going on is obviously the case. A lot of things that are moving very quickly, and we still don't know what the outcome will be. But there is a lot of reasons that we should still maintain hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are an expert in Eastern Europe. You've had your PhD defended here in Eastern Europe, but you are an American expert. And as an American, what do you think about the internal processes, political processes that are happening right now with the new administration rewriting all rules in the country, basically, and we are seeing the reflection of this in the foreign policy of the United States?
So I think it's important to note that all of foreign policy depends on domestic politics, always. So when you see a president say something, he's going to say what he says, usually because his target constituency, that is his voters, want to hear that. It's less about what the international community thinks, though the international community analyzes whatever leaders say, but that's never the target. For instance, when we had the situation in the Oval Office a few days ago with Zelensky, it's very clear that Donald Trump was repeating phrases and giving ideas that he knew his voters would like to hear. They were typical things for Donald Trump to say. J.D. Vance jumped in and said things that aligned very strongly with what MAGA voters might like to hear. And Zelensky said what Ukrainians expected him to say as the president of their country, which is he represented the needs of Ukraine. So everyone plays to a role that they have. They play to the constituency that they have. So that's the first thing. Is whenever we look at foreign policy, we have to look at the domestic demands, because that is what's going to drive the foreign policy of a country. And ultimately, I think if we look at countries and we discuss them in the abstract, it usually misses that. We talk about the role of Germany or Britain, but why do they have that role? Well, it's because their domestic audience wants that. Their voters want that. And so they'll do what their voters want them to do.
Yes, and how do you view the possible future outcome of this basically show what happened in the Oval Office? The Ukraine support from the United States will be cut off completely. Maybe even the Biden's defense support that was granted before will be cut in this administration after this pretext that happened in the Oval Office.
Well, that's definitely possible. And on Monday, today, they will decide that. So it looks like in the near term, we're going to find out. So is it possible? Most certainly. I think it's quite possible, unfortunately. But at the same time, as I said, I think there's a lot of reasons to maintain some optimism. We see that the Europeans are much more united than they were before. They've also awoken to this new reality. And I think in the long term, frankly, I know this is going to be very controversial. I think off of this incident, that will work out in Ukraine's interest. So I know many people wouldn't probably make that argument, but I think it actually will.
Yes, and some people tend to say a slow death is far, far worse than the chaos that is happening right now with Europe literally waking up in the cold shower. And I'm really encouraged by seeing Keir Starmer's press conference and how confident and how calm and intellectual he sounds after the London summit of European leaders. We see Emmanuel Macron working with that. And yeah, if they can sustain the defense support for Ukraine right now, the role of the United States for 3 years, maybe we still have a chance to hold on for another year. And yes, I don't know if you have seen the interview of Kirill Budanov, the latest one. He said that in 2026, if Russia continues the war, the expenditures for this war, some very, very bad processes in their economics will start to happen, and they literally cannot be turned back. What do you think about that?
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that's actually one factor here that we rarely talk about. So there's 3 different reasons that a war will end, right? So we usually focus on the military defeat and taking cities, and that's what's covered the most in the press. But there's 2 other factors, which we talk about a lot less, that actually I think are even more important. So one is the society itself. So societies have their own problems. They can have collapse. They can have diseases outbreak. There can be a lot of things that happen within a country that forces it to stop fighting. But there's another thing that can happen, which is the economy collapses. So a country that can no longer economically afford a war, it usually will end up losing the war. And actually, if you look historically, the amount of expenditures a country has for war is a high indication of if they're going to win the war or not. Not always, but there's a pretty good correlation. So in the case of Russia, what do we see going on? Well, we said that they have an inflation rate that's about 27, 28%, could be actually more. In addition to that, we said that there's a massive lack of labor. And the lack of labor is sort of interesting because the unemployment rate in Russia is historically at its lowest it's ever been. But as you know, when there's extremely low unemployment, it's actually an indication of high inflation. It doesn't mean that things are going just great. And we see that at this point is creating a lot of different problems. We see there's already shortages of products, very basic foodstuffs such as butter. But we see further that within Russia itself, they're having a massive demographic crisis, and the population is becoming very concerned by that. There's no way that they could keep up with the expenditures that they currently have for the hospitals and schools, but they're spending more and more on the military. It's about now 30% of their budget goes to defense, which is actually just the war in Ukraine. But there's something very important about that. The Russian government, to be able to finance this war, has been taking out money from private banks, huge amounts of money. And at this point, many of the banks are on the verge of going bust. And the reason is simple. Those banks have been subsidizing mortgages for years. Huge subsidizations from the government for people to take out mortgages. So people were taking out mortgages for houses, for apartments, and then a majority of them took out secondary loans to refurnish them, to fix them up, hoping they would rent them out. Because there was a period of time that the real estate prices in Russia just kept going higher and higher and higher. But now, real estate prices are starting to collapse. So people are totally underwater with those houses and those apartments, and they can't afford to pay them back. So as the banks are increasingly in a pinch, as people are not going to pay back those loans, well, they're also in a pinch because the government has taken out huge amounts of money. So the government's only option is to print more money to pay back those loans, the ones that the government had taken out. The mortgages themselves, which are subsidized by the government, is creating inflation. But if the government has to step in to balance those banks' balance sheets to make sure that they don't go bust, that creates even more inflation. So Russia is really an economic situation that's quite precarious. And any day, it really could go bust. Normally in a country like we've seen in Russia, what we've seen in Russia is not normal for a country where we'll see the ruble devaluate or gain value at, say, 15% in one day and then go back down a couple of days later. That's not normal to bounce up and down like that. There's significant economic problems within Russia that are structural in nature. And sooner or later, they're going to come home to roost.
Yes, I can see all the problems that you underlined in different publications of economic publishers and everything else. I may note that Ukraine has actually similar problems with inflation, with the lack of labor because obviously of mobilization and the need to defend our country, but there's a huge difference. Ukraine is on the defense in this battle, and Russia is on the offense. They can end the war any day. They can end it today by saying, okay, we're going out of this, no more money for the war, no more war, and the war starts at this point. And Ukraine simply cannot stop because, you know, if Ukrainians stop shooting, then Ukraine stops existing. Then the Russians will actually try to occupy the entire territory. And that's a huge difference. But in most cases with the economy, there are some similarities. Maybe, yes?
Well, there's actually, I think, a very big difference that's even more important than the fact that Ukraine's defending itself, which is that Russia is having to print money and take out loans to pay for this military. I mean, this has been a huge expenditure. It's forced them to close down a lot of public services to afford more military. But more important than that is that they are actually having to pay for it. In the case of Ukraine, a lot of the money that's going through and a lot of the weapons is not being paid for by Ukraine. It's by foreign support. So when we're looking at the economic data that's coming out of Russia or coming out of Ukraine, that's public because much of what Russia publishes is no longer, or used to publish, is no longer being published because the situation is so bad. But when you look at the data, we're not looking at the same sort of situation. Ukraine is being heavily subsidized. So it's not facing the exact same pressures that Russia is. Russia's pressures are very real. Look, I mean, since Trump has taken office, both China as well as India have said that they're going to stop buying Russian oil if it violates U.S. sanctions because they're scared of the risk of American sanctions, quite rationally, as both countries do far more trade with the U.S. than they do with Russia. So looking ahead, what does that mean? Well, if oil prices continue to decrease, which is estimated to do, Russia's going to be in a tougher and tougher situation. And I think in the long term, it's not a situation that's going to be able to survive.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. J. You've inserted some hope, I believe, in our viewers too, as well as me. Maybe some final remarks on our today's interview about your insights, your prognosis on the situation, or maybe just a couple of words to reinforce your belief.
So I think that when we're looking at the situation, I know a lot of people are alarmed by what's going on with the United States. I am as well, of course. At the same time, I'm not panicked and I'm not afraid of it. Because if we look at what this really does mean, it means a few things. It means that Europe today is in a different position than it was before. The US had always played the dominant role in security in the NATO structure. But at this point, it's very clear that the Europeans understand they have to provide for their own security. And the Europeans, much more than the Americans, appreciate the fact that their security depends on Ukraine's security. So I think at this point, they have a much better consensus and much more clear consensus that fine, if the Americans won't be involved, then we'll have to take matters into our own hands. Remember, it was during the Biden administration that it was forbidden by Ukraine, Biden administration forbid Ukraine from being able to use long-range weapons that were coming from the US as well as coming from our European allies. Imagine that. We are as European allies who said we allow the Ukrainians to use these to attack within Russia. And the Americans said, no, you cannot, because we helped produce those weapons, or we produced all those weapons, and so you cannot do that. At this point, though, the Europeans understand it doesn't matter what the Americans think. They have to protect their own security. And I don't think that the White House could put restrictions on them. They'll allow them to do what they need to do in order to better secure their own future and secure Europe's future. And the best way to secure Europe's future is to secure Ukraine's future.
Yes, and there's an idea of the common European army. And imagine if Ukraine's military will be part of that joint European force of the defense. That will be a force to recognize on the continent indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Smart.
Most certainly.
Yes, it was Jason J. Smart on UATV and this very good comment for our today's episode. Thank you very much and take care.
The global press and European leaders reacted sharply to the public diplomatic scandal between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during their meeting in the Oval Office. According to journalists from the Financial Times, Vice President J.D. Vance and President Trump appeared to have prepared for a confrontation with Zelensky, possibly to weaken his position ahead of future negotiations.
In the past 2 weeks, Trump has done everything to undermine Zelensky, making early concessions to Moscow and depicting Ukraine as the aggressor in the 3-year war. From the Financial Times publication.
The New York Times describes the meeting between Zelensky and Trump's team as a diplomatic confrontation. According to the media, Trump and Vance criticized Zelensky for allegedly not being sufficiently grateful for U.S. support in Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression and tried to pressure him into accepting a peace deal on terms dictated by the U.S.
The president's verbal assault on Mr. Zelensky was a stunning display of anger and resentment toward the leader of a country that has been invaded by a larger power intent on eliminating it as an independent state. No other president in memory has lashed out at a visiting foreign leader in the Oval Office on camera in such a vituperative way, not even at an adversary of the United States, much less a putative ally. From the New York Times publication.
The New York Times also pointed out that Trump's behavior raised serious questions about the reliability of the US as an ally. A hostile meeting in which Trump and J.D. Vance publicly, literally berated Volodymyr Zelensky. This is how the Wall Street Journal describes the situation in the Oval Office. Journalists compared this meeting to a bar fight when Trump and J.D. Vance demanded respect and gratitude from Zelensky. According to Spiegel journalist René Pfister, Trump not only poorly prepared any potential deal, but even worse, created the impression that there is no clear difference between Russia, the aggressor, and Ukraine, the victim of the aggression.
Trump's foreign policy, based solely on power dynamics, sends an unmistakable message to the old world. There are no longer any guarantees or reliability in relations with the U.S. The transatlantic alliance is dead. We now live in new geopolitical jungles, ruled by those who believe only in tanks and nuclear warheads. Trump may still claim loyalty to NATO, but what is the word of someone who called Zelensky a dictator just to push through a favorable deal worth? From the Spiegel publication.
Regardless of personal opinions about Zelensky or his rhetoric, what matters is that he represents a nation under attack, defending itself heroically every day. Meanwhile, not a single word was said about Vladimir Putin. As Bild noted, what occurred in the Oval Office was simply indescribable. Many other German outlets published similar coverage.
They spoke loudly and harshly, sometimes wagging their fingers. They interrupted the Ukrainian president, mocking him and his people on camera. It was painful to watch, not only because it significantly worsened Ukraine's chances of defending itself against Russian attacks, but also because of the sheer disrespect shown by the U.S. president and his vice president towards the representative of a country under assault. From the Zet online publication.
In a Guardian article titled "Diplomacy Dies on Live TV," the White House meeting was called one of the greatest diplomatic disasters in modern history.
As Trump got into a shouting match with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, a horrified Europe watched the post-Second World War order crumble before its eyes. Never has a U.S. president bullied and berated an adversary, still less an ally, in such a public way. Zelensky found himself ambushed by Trump and his serpentine vice president, J.D. Vance. He was expected to sit back and take a beating. He refused. From the Guardian publication.
During the meeting, Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance accused Zelensky of allegedly being insufficiently grateful for U.S. support in Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression. However, CNN reported that since 2022, Zelensky has publicly expressed his gratitude to the U.S., its officials and its citizens at least 33 times. The outlet even published a list of Zelensky's public statements in English, all containing words of thanks to the United States. Reported by Sergey Kulas, Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Shtengilov, UATV News. Not to praise Trump personally, Russian propagandists have received new instructions from the Kremlin on how to talk about US President Donald Trump. The reason for this shift is the ongoing negotiations between the US and Russia. Unlike previous American presidents, radical criticism of Trump is now off limits. According to the Verstka media, citing sources close to the Putin administration, propagandists have not received strict directives to present the supposed warming of US-Russia relations in a particular way. However, they have been ordered to maintain a so-called balance in their reporting as the negotiations could ultimately stall.
An employee of a major state media outlet described the new content policy as follows: "We don't make promises about the end of the special military operation. We don't give any deadlines. The main thing is that they have made contact, and we are ready to listen." An insider working for the state TV channel said that there are no instructions to force anything. It is only necessary to balance Trump with statements from the Russian side. From the Verstka article.
Every authoritarian regime needs an external enemy. For Russia, this enemy has always been the West, and now specifically Europe. During a recent meeting between US President and French President Emmanuel Macron discussed the possibility of NATO spending troops to Ukraine. In response, Russian propaganda outlets launched a wave of insults directed at Macron. However, experts believe that the Kremlin's temporary thaw towards the US will not last long.
They are not rushing to embrace Trump, fully understanding that today things are one way, and tomorrow they may be completely different. The general directive is to leave Americans alone for now, focus on the British, the French, the Germans, but don't touch the Americans. During Trump's first presidency, Margarita Simonian once declared she would drive around Moscow waving an American flag in celebration. However, even back then, Trump's presidency did not turn out well for Russian propagandists.
After Macron and Trump's negotiations, Putin immediately gave an interview to Russian media. The Russian dictator claimed that Russia supposedly has more resources than Ukraine. Russia decided to become a raw materials supplier to the United States after propagandists mocked the negotiation process between the United States and Ukraine on rare earth metals. In this agreement, Putin seems to have seen prospects for major deals with the US.
People are confused. The blatant sale of rare earth metals and the possibility of handing them over to the U.S., it's too much. Some pro-Kremlin bloggers support it, others don't. Many still don't grasp what's happening. But the overall reaction is delayed because, historically, no American president has ever truly benefited Russia.
Russian propaganda is now contradicting itself and falling apart. The objectives of the so-called special military operation are increasingly unclear, putting pro-war mobilization efforts at risk. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the imposition of Western sanctions, Russian media has insisted that domestic production could replace Western goods. Sanctions have included bans on Russian oil and petroleum imports, asset freezes for major Russian companies, financial restrictions and export bans on technology and dual-use goods. As a result, Russia now lacks airplane components, military equipment repair is idle, and losses from sanctions are at all-time high. In 2024, the budget deficit in Russia amounted to 3.5 billion rubles.
Russia's economic situation is dire. The so-called lifeline Trump is throwing may well turn into an anchor. We no longer understand the logic, why this war was fought for 3 years, why 350,000 men were mobilized and sent to the trenches, why over 1 million signed military contracts, why there are hundreds of thousands of dead, wounded, and missing, and why millions have become refugees.
According to Bloomberg, Putin's special representative for foreign economic cooperation Kirill Dmitriev is using business proposals to pressure the US into a deal favorable to the Kremlin. The goal is to lift sanctions on Russia. Dmitriev proposed that Putin sell around 2 million tons of Siberian aluminium to the US in exchange for Trump lifting import restrictions. He also suggested that Russian companies could set up joint ventures with American firms for aluminium production. Reported by Sergei Kulias, Victoria Smirnova, UATV News.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці.
I wish you health, fellow Ukrainians. A few key updates for today. I held a staff meeting where we analyzed support packages and some contracts secured over this time. There are good results on artillery contracts. Ukraine needs a solid foundation. Next, drones. An unwavering priority. Air defense. Additional systems have now arrived in Ukraine from Lithuania. Thanks a lot, Mr. President. The Prime Minister of Ukraine reported today on finances for this year. We are securing all necessary funding and will get through 2025 financially. There were also some special issues concerning our national resilience on the staff meeting agenda today. We are working on all possible scenarios to protect Ukraine. The baseline scenario is to hold positions and create conditions for proper diplomacy for the soonest possible end to this war with a decent peace. We need peace, real, fair peace, not endless war, and we need security guarantees. It was precisely the lack of security guarantees for Ukraine 11 years ago that allowed Russia to start with the occupation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. Then, the absence of security guarantees allowed Russia to launch the full-scale invasion. And now, because there are still no defined security guarantees, it is Russia that is keeping this war going. The whole world sees this. The whole world acknowledges this. Today, we continued working with our European partners on a special diplomatic and security framework that can bring peace closer. In particular, this is what we discussed in London recently, and what we had spoken about with many world leaders before that. Ukraine, all of Europe and America. Together we can ensure decades of peace, and for this, we must stay constructive, work together, complement each other's proposals, and speed up diplomacy to end the war. I spoke today with the leaders of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. A good conversation about the outcomes of the London summit, about opportunities and perspectives on all processes involving the United States, and about defense support that saves lives of our people. I am grateful to the Baltic states for standing so firmly with Ukraine. Thank you once again for your support, friends. Glory to Ukraine.
Massive UAV raid on Russian oil infrastructure. This was reported by the General Staff of Ukraine. Facilities in two regions were hit, in particular at night in the Rostov region of the Russian Federation. An oil pumping infrastructure involved in supplying the army of invaders was hit. Powerful explosions and a fire were recorded on the territory of the facility. Also, an oil refinery was attacked in Sызrань, Samara region, and a fire started there. And in the Rostov region of Russia, an oil pipeline caught fire due to a drone attack. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has presented a Rearm Europe plan to increase EU defense spending and said that Europe could mobilize around 800 billion euros for this. According to her, part of the plan is to increase the use of public defense funding at the national level. The second proposal would provide 150 billion euros in loans to member states for defense investments. The European Commission expects that this will help member states pool demand and carry out joint procurement, and they can also significantly strengthen their support for Ukraine. US President Donald Trump has suspended all military aid to Ukraine after a row with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office last week, US media reported. According to Bloomberg and Fox News, the pause will last, quote, until Trump determines that the country's leaders demonstrate a good faith commitment to peace. According to Bloomberg, the order applies of all US military equipment that is not currently in Ukraine, including weapons in transit on planes and ships or waiting in transit zones in Poland. A ceasefire and security guarantees for Ukraine must become a fundamental part of any potential peace agreement currently under discussion among Ukraine's allies. Ukraine needs to be strengthened in its defense capabilities and supported in its resistance to any form of aggression. NATO has announced that the alliance is on track to fulfill its 2025 defense funding plan for Ukraine, amounting to 40 billion euros. After talks with US President Donald Trump, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that alliance members will continue to support Ukraine.
On Ukraine, allies are preparing billions more in aid plus contributions to security guarantees. Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, on social network X.
Deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine is considered a key element in ensuring future security guarantees. In recent weeks, European countries have intensified discussions about sending Western contingents to Ukraine to oversee a possible future ceasefire. According to Bloomberg sources, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has discussed the potential deployment of Turkish troops to Ukraine with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Turkey has NATO's second-largest army after the United States. Turkey's willingness to help oversee a potential ceasefire is seen as an important step in easing the burden on European allies, who are currently developing plans for a European peacekeeping mission in Ukraine.
Russia didn't give a response to Turkey on the matter of sending forces to Ukraine, although the topic was discussed with Lavrov during his recent visit. A person close to Russian government said, "Turkey backs Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity," according to a Ukrainian official familiar with the talks, adding that Ankara supports peace and security guarantees that are reliable. From the Bloomberg publication,
European participation in the negotiation process is crucial. Overseas, reaching an agreement will be difficult, believes EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Kaja Kallas. In her view, Europe must play a central role in any deal involving Ukraine.
Why are we in NATO? It is because we are afraid of Russia. And the only thing that really works, the only security guarantee that works, is NATO's umbrella Kaja Kallas, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy.
Analysts agree that NATO membership remains the strongest security guarantee for Ukraine.
Putin would have to think twice about restarting a war if he thinks the major Western powers are obligated to defend Ukraine. Of course, bringing Ukraine into NATO would put American and European skin and credibility in the game. That explains Trump's hesitation, even resistance to such a concept. Peter Roff, senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute think tank, in an interview with Fox News.
The EU country willing to take the lead in providing security guarantees to Ukraine is likely to assume a dominant role in the region. Support for Ukraine within the EU remains stable, experts note.
Support for Ukraine hasn't changed. What has evolved is the understanding of how that support should be structured and its time frames. When we talk about specific countries like Hungary or Slovakia, their positions and visions for Ukraine's role might differ. But if we look at public opinion, it remains largely pro-Ukrainian, even in those countries.
French President Emmanuel Macron, after meeting with US President Donald Trump, called for building a lasting peace in Ukraine. Europe is prepared to offer Ukraine security guarantees, including the deployment of peacekeepers. As part of this initiative, France and the United Kingdom have developed a joint plan aimed at providing security guarantees for Ukraine. Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Victoria Smirnova, UATV News.
As the world watches the unraveling of the US-led international order, one thing has become increasingly clear. The United States is no longer the global leader, at least not the same one as it once was. The rapid erosion of America's credibility and influence concluded or started by the infamous confrontation between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office marks a pivotal moment in global politics. In a year that has seen unpredictable and unprecedented turmoil, Europe is presented with an urgent need and opportunity to step into the void left by the US political will and reshape the future of the international system. The Trump administration's public scandal with Zelensky, a leader fighting for his country's survival against Russian aggression, is a symbolic of a broader change in American leadership. As Trump and his allies, including J.D. Vance, the vice president, increasingly pursue isolationist and contradictory to Euro-Atlantic policies, the damage to US reputation looks to be profound at this moment. Allies are being alienated and rogue states are capitalizing on the vacuum left behind. What was once a unipolar world under US dominance is now fragmenting, with Europe at a crossroads. Europe, however, is not as weak as it may seem. Despite Trump's disruptive policies and the lingering effects of Brexit, Europe remains the economic and military powerhouse. The combined continent's GDP is comparable to that of the United States, and its military forces are among the most capable and experienced in the world. Of course, I count Ukraine in. Europe also has a wealth of industrial and technological resources that can be mobilized for defense. The question is not whether Europe has the power to lead. It unquestionably does. Who's going to be the leader? The one. Who do you think that might be? The question is also whether it will seize this moment and take responsibility for its own security and that of Ukraine. As Donald Tusk, Polish Prime Minister, said before leaving for London this weekend, why 500 million Europeans ask 300 million Americans to defend them from 140 million Russians? It seems that the lesson of Munich has been learned. And I leave you to decide which of the lessons I'm talking about. The ongoing war on the territory of Ukraine serves as a critical test for Europe's resolve. As Russia continues its unprovoked invasion, Ukraine stands at the front line of European security, fighting not just for its own sovereignty, but for the principles of democracy and international law that underpin Europe's security architecture. While the US has provided significant support, Europe must take on the primary responsibility for ensuring Ukraine's defense and for fostering lasting peace on the continent. Ukraine's resilience on the battlefield is nothing short of extraordinary. Despite the overwhelming odds, Ukraine has managed to push back Russian forces in key areas, including in regions like Pokrovsk and Kursk. The Ukrainian military, although facing a well-armed adversary, has proven that Russia can be defeated. The war has come at a tremendous cost to Russia, with significant military and economic setbacks. Russia's artillery advantage once was 10-1, and it has dwindled now to just 1.5-1. And despite the support it has received from rogue states like North Korea and Iran, Russia's military has been stretched thin, suffering catastrophic losses indeed. In contrast, Europe's resources and military infrastructure position it well to support Ukraine. Countries like Germany, France, and the UK have the industrial capability to manufacture the weapons and equipment needed to equip Ukraine and bolster its defenses on its own. Additionally, the nuclear deterrence provided by France and UK can fill the void left by a retreating American presence. Europe has everything it needs to ensure Ukraine's victory and, crucially, to prevent future Russian aggression. However, Europe's role must not stop at military support. It is essential for Europe to lead the charge in diplomatic and economic support as well. European countries working together can help Ukraine secure a just and lasting peace. But for that to happen, Europe must take a hard look at its own political and defense structures and make the necessary investments to ensure it can maintain peace and stability in its own region. While Europe has long relied on the United States for military and strategic leadership, the current moment demands a fundamental shift. The events of February 2025, the political spat between Trump and Zelensky, are a wake-up call for Europe. The US under Trump is no longer an ally that can be trusted in Europe at everything. As the US retreats inward, Europe must take responsibility for its own future. Europe's defense capabilities are vast, but they need to be better integrated and coordinated. Countries like Poland, which has been investing heavily in its military and economy, are leading the way. Poland's growing influence in the region is a reflection of a larger trend. Europe is awakening to the fact that its future security depends on its ability to act independently of the US. Poland's military strengths, along with the industrial might of Germany, France and the UK, could provide the backbone for a European-led defense strategy. The combined forces of Europe could ensure that Ukraine is supported and protected without the need to rely on Washington. The decline of the US as a global leader, coupled with the rise of authoritarianism in some parts of the world, presents both a challenge and an opportunity for Europe. The continent must step into the leadership void and be the guarantor of global stability, if it can, of course. The responsibility extends beyond Ukraine. Europe must commit to fostering democratic values, upholding the rule of law, and preventing future wars on its own soil. European leaders are beginning to understand this responsibility. The response to Trump's assault on Zelensky was swift and forceful, with European leaders reaffirming their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Macron, Scholz, and even Trudeau have all pledged their support for Ukraine in various forums, but it is clear that more must be done. Europe cannot afford to wait for a change of leadership in the US. The future of European security and that of Ukraine depends on Europe's willingness to lead now. So what is the path forward for Europe? First, it must continue to invest in Ukraine's defense, ensuring that it is equipped to win the war and maintain peace. Second, Europe must invest in its own defense infrastructure, scaling up production of military technology and ensuring that its armed forces are unified and cohesive. Lastly, Europe must engage in a broader diplomatic strategy that includes forging stronger ties with global democratic powers like Japan and South Korea. In conclusion, the opportunity for Europe to lead has never been more urgent. The US is retreating from its global responsibilities, and as it does so, Europe must step up to secure its future and the future of us, of Ukraine. The continent has the resources, the political will, and the military power to do so. The time for Europe to take control of its own destiny is now. The question is no longer whether Europe can lead, it is whether it will. So greetings, Madame Akhvlediani, to our UATV studio, and today we would like to talk about Europe, because Europe knows best how to defend itself, how to lead itself. And for you as a research fellow and scholar in this sphere, what do you think? What is the mood right now in Europe? Is it united and willing, or it is only united and unwilling to do something serious?
I think it's a very decisive moment for the Union itself, because all these things that are happening within Ukraine has really pushed the European Union to actually come together. And what we are witnessing now is really deepening the unity and also the willingness, and it's a great wake-up moment for entire European Union to really face the truth, that the Union should be ready to defend itself and its candidate countries. And this is the war in Ukraine that really brought this, moment of waking up. So I would say it's getting united, and it's also getting willing to, step up its efforts on many fronts, whatever it takes.
Mm-hmm. And have you seen the change in some moods maybe in Europe after the meeting in London? Because there has been some decisive changes announced, and we cannot forget about Hungary and Slovakia, which have still the veto right to cancel almost everything that is done on the consensus principle in Europe. So we have some moods up from London and then a mood down in Budapest, unfortunately.
I think the mood in Budapest and in Slovakia, let's say, it has been always resisting, right? This is a mood that we are aware. This is a position we are aware they're having. But it still does not deter the other member states of the European Union to step up their efforts, to step up their engagement with Ukraine. It also unites wider Europe, right? What we're witnessing now, this is not just the EU member states, but this is Norway, this is Canada, this is UK coming all together at the table, which is a greater unity of the wider Europe. So to me, that is much more promising than reminding ourselves about Hungary and Slovakia, which may be diverging from the common opinion. But even when we look at the Hungary's and Slovakia's position, what we've learned in the past, whenever it was a decisive moment to take an action, EU action, when it came to the sanctions, when it came to the supporting of Ukraine, Hungary's veto has been bypassed. Right? So I think as an expert, I see that EU with a strong position amongst the other member states, other than Hungary and let's say Slovakia, they still had the leverage, to bypass the Hungary's veto. So I see only more, strengthening of the common position and only more willingness to find a ways around of potential vetoes.
And do you consider that Ukraine's accession by 2030 is possible for the European Union, Ukraine to join the Union? Because we always hear from people in Eastern Europe, that part of the European Union, that Ukraine is so corrupt, you cannot change Ukraine, all the money is being stolen, oh, no, please, no Ukraine and European Union, it will kill our farmers. It was the same with Poland. It was the same with Romania, as far as I remember. What do you think about that? Is it possible before 2030?
Now, this is a very good question, and I think answer to that really depends who you ask this question. I'm currently tuning in from Ideas Lab. This is the biggest event that my organization has, and we just had Commissioner Martako speaking today here, who said, if the reforms in Ukraine continue with the speed, we may see Ukraine joining the European Union before 2030. And I'm quoting the commissioner. So I think the mood in Brussels is that, it really depends on the speed of reforms, where Ukraine is excelling together with Moldova. Despite being in war, Ukraine has been moving very fast. So if we manage that speed is there with the reforms, I think Brussels is promising with the merit-based approach that enlargement may take place 2030 or even earlier. Here, what we have to think is another angle of the enlargement policy. So one is merit-based reforms, but another one is, geopolitical situation where Europe stands and whether the EU itself is ready to enlarge. And that brings us to your question that you asked, which was more from the budget considerations, right? What will it mean for the EU spending? What will it mean for the EU's budget? And the thing I think you have pointed out quite well, that comparisons can be drawn to the other other member states that have joined the European Union back in 2004. And we've been here before with the similar concerns. What happens if large economy like Poland will join the EU? But what we've seen, EU has found the solutions and the ways out to, welcome these new member states without having any losses. In fact, the European Union has only won. European Union has become stronger player, economic player, and also wealthier. And convergence rates that we have spotted across the member states that have joined the European Union back in 2004 is really high. They really converged with the existing member states. So I think this is the lessons that the EU already has. As the tools or the solutions, also drawing parallels with the past enlargement, is that EU has this transition period. So when the new member states come, they usually sign the accession treaties. And in accession treaties, we can put a lot of things. You can put transition periods, for instance, transition periods for the labor mobility, transition periods. To what extent Ukrainian farmers would accede and would have access to the EU budget or the EU support. So this is all up to the negotiation. This is not static. This is not fixed. This is all up to the negotiation between the European Union and Ukraine. So I'm very optimistic. I don't think we should be concerned about this at all. I think this is some argument that has been a bit manipulated, and a lot of the public opinion about this perhaps is a bit biased, because this is not what we see in research.
So you confirm the thesis probably that this topic of Ukraine destroying the agriculture sector of European Union is more a manipulation and populism rather than real politics.
Well, it really depends how you frame and how you play with everything that country has to offer, right? One thing is that Ukraine is indeed a large economy with a lot of people, right? Around 40 million people before the war. So, but this has to be taken as a strength, not as a weakness, right? The Ukraine brings a lot to the European Union. It can bring a lot to the European Union. It can bring really fertile lands, assuming we will demine all this land after the war and the country will reconstruct. Ukraine brings a lot of raw materials, which is a big asset, right? So, and a lot of experience of dealing with a good governance, trade, finding solutions for keeping up the trade during the war. I mean, this is no easy task what Ukraine has done. So Ukraine has a lot to offer in terms of resources, in terms of policies, in terms of lessons learned. And these, if utilized properly, should not be weaponized, but instead that should be taken as an asset, right? European Union should take it as an asset to become a larger and a stronger economic player in the world markets.
Thank you very much. So that is negotiable. I believe that Ukraine and EU will find a solution to this agriculture question and the labor mobility, as millions of Ukrainians right now live in the European Union countries as refugees, the seekers of asylum from the war, and they are, most of them, working right now. So some of the people, like the elderly ones, maybe are not working, but personally I know many people who are working inside Europe right now. And yeah, I believe we will find a solution, and we just have to keep moving. That's the mood. We have to keep moving after everything that has happened over the weekend, I believe. And maybe some final remarks from you, something to reinforce our courage.
Well, for Ukrainians, I think everybody is looking at Ukrainians, how brave-hearted all the people are, and also how they support currently Zelensky, the president, who's been in an impossible situation, pushed by Trump's uncertainty and really change of heart and change of sight. And so, everybody is quite impressed. Everyone follows very warmly and very closely, at least from Brussels, how Ukrainians feel how they support their president who only had to have this strong message that, this is not Ukraine who should compromise. This is Russia who's been invader. This is Russia who's broke the international law. And so we should all unite about it. And I think the world and Europe is really getting united about that. So Ukrainians, stay stronger. Europe is with you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ahmediani, Madloba, for this interview. And I am really energized by this one. You really insert some good hope and good mood into the interview with your kind words. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad to hear that.
Yes, and have a good summit out there in Brussels. We hope that both Georgia and Ukraine could sit in Brussels in those committees one day and decide some bureaucratic, these lazy, these dull questions of what tariff should be on this import or that export, and not decide how to win a war.
Yeah, that's a very good thought.
Okay, thank you again, and have a nice day.
Kyiv and Paris are discussing the possibility of using profits from frozen Russian assets to invest in joint weapons production. This proposal was raised during a meeting between Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense for European Integration Serhiy Boyev and Pierre Heilbronn, the French President's special envoy for Ukraine's relief and reconstruction. According to Boyev, Ukraine's most urgent needs include air defense and missile defense systems, interceptor missiles, heavy armored vehicles and ammunition.
In addition to investments and developing production, Ukraine is also interested in purchasing ready-made weapons. Our needs remain significant. The situation on the front is dynamic, so we require fast solutions. Continuing support from our partners and their readiness to increase it are crucial for us. Ukraine must remain strong on the battlefield. This is essential for achieving lasting peace. Serhiy Boyev, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine for European Integration, on the ministry's website.
The use of profits from frozen Russian assets was also raised during a meeting between the presidents of France and the United States at the White House. Donald Trump claimed that Ukraine is supposedly repaying Europe for financial assistance, whereas the US, according to him, receives nothing in return. French President Emmanuel Macron countered, explaining that the EU partially offsets funds sent to Kyiv with the profits from frozen Russian assets.
We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day and Russia would have paid for that.
Since the freezing of Russian assets following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the aggressor state, Kyiv's partners have focused solely on the use of profits generated from these assets. Experts know that European leaders have been wary of full confiscation, fearing it could undermine international trust in the EU's financial system. However, calls to seize all frozen Russian assets are growing. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna recently stated that Europe must use all available frozen Russian assets. His position has been supported by Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, Sweden, Poland and the Czech Republic. According to analysts, the idea of full confiscation is gaining momentum within the EU.
One is obviously a renewed debt. The historical example that's always given is the emergency credit that the European Union took to fight the economic consequences of the pandemic a couple of years ago, 5 years ago to be exact. And the other track which the European Union is considering is, confiscating the frozen Russian assets, which are more than 200 billion euros and are held in the European Union, most of them actually in Belgium.
Analysts believe that a revision of the strategy regarding frozen Russian assets may begin on March 6 during the European Leaders' Summit on Defense. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Kaja Kallas stated that reaching consensus on this issue is still a long way off. But more and more countries are becoming open to the idea of confiscation.
So I am not that optimistic that we will reach an agreement in March. But at the same time, I must say the work is ongoing. And I must also say that during this Foreign Affairs Council, there was one more country that came who used to be against moving on with this and came on board, because this is what I've always said. You know, eventually, especially in the situation where we are right now, then eventually we all come to the conclusion that our taxpayers shouldn't be the one who are paying for this. It should come from the country that destroys Ukraine, which is Russia. Glory to Ukraine.
By the end of 2027, the G7 countries have committed to providing Ukraine with a 50 billion euros loan, financed by profits from frozen Russian assets. According to analysts at the Ukrainian Center for Economic Research, Ukraine's budget could allocate 5 to 7 billion euros from this loan for defense spending in 2025. Reported by Serhiy Kulas, Andriy Dmytrenko, UATV News.
In Vermont, over 1,000 demonstrators greeted Vice President J.D. Vance's cortege with slogans such as "Go ski in Russia," "Vermont stands with Ukraine," and "Support Ukraine, not Putin." Vance had come to Vermont for a vacation at a ski resort after his meeting with the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, at the White House Oval Office.
Every day, the Trump-Vance administration is putting Vermonters at risk and hurting Vermonters. He's also hurting everyone in this country, and he's hurting our allies like Ukraine. Dan Vidali, resident of Montpellier, in an interview with VT Digger.
On Saturday, March 1st, dozens of Ukraine supporters protested outside the White House at Lafayette Square, calling for continued U.S. support for Ukraine following a heated exchange between President of U.S. Donald Trump and President of Ukraine Zelensky in the Oval Office.
I think this meeting shows that Ukrainians and Americans must continue fighting together because we're trying to counter Russian propaganda. We hear many Russian narratives coming out of this Oval Office. We know Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom and we are defending them. Russia started the invasion. We're just defending ourselves. We can't achieve peace on our side, but Russia could stop it at any moment.
The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has explained his positions after a heated conversation with the President of the U.S., Donald Trump, at the White House. On X, a social network, he wrote that he could not agree to the terms of the ceasefire with Russia that were dangerous for Ukraine.
We are very grateful to the United States for all the support. I'm thankful to President Trump, Congress for their bipartisan support, and American people. Ukrainians have always appreciated this support, especially during these 3 years of full-scale invasion. American people helped save our people. Humans and human rights come first. We're truly thankful. We want only strong relations with America, and I really hope we will have them. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, on X social network.
Zelensky also mentioned that Ukraine is ready to sign an agreement on minerals, which could be a first step towards security guarantees. However, he stressed that a ceasefire without security guarantees would be dangerous for Ukraine. Prime Minister of Poland Donald Tusk said the US position on the Russian war against Ukraine is not as clear-cut as Poland's. The Prime Minister of UK Keir Starmer expressed his trust in Ukrainian President Zelensky and stated that he didn't think Zelensky had done anything wrong recently. The UK and France will work on a peace agreement with Ukraine and present it to President Trump, Starmer announced on Sunday, March 2nd, calling it the right move after the White House meeting on Friday.
We've now agreed that the United Kingdom, along with France and possibly one or two others, will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting. And then we'll discuss that plan with the United States. So in those calls on Friday night, through the meeting yesterday, into the calls again last night, I think we've got a step in the right direction because, as I say, nobody wants to see what happened on Friday, but it's really important that we keep our central focus, which is lasting peace in Ukraine.
According to the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, Europe needs a plan for peace in Ukraine. Stubb had previously outlined a multi-phase peace plan. The first phase would focus on strengthening Ukraine's positions and putting pressure on Russia. The second phase would involve a ceasefire with security guarantees for Ukraine, supported by Europe and the US. And the third phase would address the peace process, covering issues like territory, finance, and reconstruction.
We need a plan, and that's why we're here.
I want to see some kind of a sketch of a plan on two fronts. First, how do we get through the next few days? And how do we get Zelensky and Donald Trump to talk to each other again? How do we secure the minerals deal? Because I really believe this will be a turning point for American engagement and commitment to Ukraine. And secondly, I want to see a long-term plan.
The president of Lithuania stated the US and Ukraine must return to the negotiating table after a meeting with Prime Minister of the UK Starmer and Baltic leaders. During an emergency international security summit held in London on Sunday, March 2nd, European leaders discussed how they could work together to ensure a just and lasting peace. As Prime Minister of the UK Starmer remarked, even when Russia talks about peace, it continues its relentless aggression against Ukraine. Reported by Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Shtenhelov, UATV News.
Дорогі українці, українки.
Dear Ukrainians, today many people have the same question. What will happen next with U.S. assistance? I have instructed Ukraine's Minister of Defense, the heads of our intelligence agencies, and our diplomats to contact their counterparts in the United States and obtain official information. People should not have to guess. Ukraine and America deserve a respectful dialogue and a clear position from one another, especially when it comes to protecting lives during a full-scale war. Of course, in Ukraine, we have been receiving various signals for weeks now, and there has already been a precedent for aid being halted. There was a suspension of humanitarian aid, of energy aid. There was also a halt in military aid at the end of January, but at that time everything was quickly resumed. We saw the risks. Therefore, our agencies, both military and special services, managed to develop action algorithms for any developments in the situation. This is not 2022 anymore. Our resilience is stronger now. We have the means to defend ourselves. But for us, maintaining normal, partnership-based relations with America is essential to bringing the war to a real end. None of us wants an endless war. Ukraine will always be grateful to the U.S. for all the support that has been and is being provided, and which is working to preserve the now rather fragile foundations of security in Europe. After all, this is not just about our country. It is about everyone in Europe. We seek constructive cooperation, partnership-based relations. We can only regret what happened at the White House instead of our negotiations. But we must find the strength to move forward, to respect one another, just as we have always respected America, Europe, and all our partners, and to do everything together to bring peace closer. And I thank everyone who is supporting Ukraine in this effort. Today, I have already spoken with the President of Finland, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister of Greece, the Prime Minister of Croatia, the NATO Secretary General, and the leader of Germany's CDU party, Friedrich Merz, the very party that won the recent Bundestag elections. Clear support for Ukraine. Thank you. There is very important news from the European Commission about significant funds for Europe's defense. For us, this primarily means additional air defense, more systems, more missiles, and increased ability to protect our cities and villages, our positions. And all of this creates a solid additional foundation for efforts to bring the war to an end. We will continue consultations, and new joint steps will follow. Ukraine deserves peace. Ukrainians deserve respect. And one last thing. We know that the Russians have not changed their positions or demands regarding Ukraine. They will insist on reducing our army. They will seek a legal renunciation of our territories, as well as a significant political deformation of Ukraine with the weakening of the Ukrainian constitution. But I will say that, in fact, as long as we all in Ukraine stand together and stand strong, as long as we are here, no one will succeed in this. Peace will be dignified. Glory to Ukraine.
Поки ми тут, ні в кого це не вийде. Мир буде достойним. Слава Україні!
Senior US officials had secret talks with Zelensky before Trump's speech to Congress, two sources familiar with the talks told CNN. According to the channel, Trump officials stressed the importance of stabilizing relations with the White House as soon as possible and urged Ukrainians to resume talks before the president's speech to Congress on Tuesday evening. Among those who contacted Zelensky was Trump's ambassador to Ukraine, Kate Kellogg, one of the sources said. Maps from the Pan-European Volt Party will send a 9-point action plan to EU leaders today ahead of a special summit of EU leaders. The plan, seen by Politico, calls on leaders to strip Hungary of its voting rights, appoint the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Kaja Kallas as the EU's full foreign minister, and propose creating a joint European army. French President Emmanuel Macron is considering traveling to Washington again along with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to meet US President Donald Trump. French government spokeswoman Sophie Prima said on Tuesday. The spokeswoman did not provide details.
Far-right political forces in Romania held a large rally in central Bucharest, demanding the resignation of Prime Minister of Romania, Marcel Ciolacu. According to Radio Free Europe's Romania service, around 30,000 people participated in the protest. The rally was organized by the Radical Right Alliance for the Unity of Romanians, which secured 9% of the vote in the parliamentary elections on December 1st, 2024. Former presidential candidate Călin Georgescu, who faces multiple criminal charges, joined the protesters. During the rally, Georgescu called for his reinstatement in the upcoming elections scheduled for May. Previously, Georgescu had won the first round, but his result was annulled. The country's intelligence services claimed the candidate might have received illegal support from Russia. On February 26th, Georgescu was arrested and brought in for questioning by the Prosecutor General's office regarding the funding of his campaign.
Georgescu is known for his pro-Russian and anti-Western views and for proposing the revision of Ukraine's borders in favor of Romania. His arrest and the subsequent criminal charges could signal Romania's intent to tighten control over pro-Russian political movements within the country.
Călin Georgescu faces 6 criminal charges, potentially leading to up to 25 years in prison. The decision on whether he will be allowed to participate in the election campaign will be made by Romania's Constitutional Court. However, the investigation into the pro-Russian politician and his associates continues, and the situation is developing unfavorably for him. The Romanian Prosecutor General's office has detained 18 people in connection with Georgescu's case. Arrest warrants have also been issued for the head of security, Horatiu Potra, his son, and another family member. Potra fled to Dubai before police searched his home.
Georgescu's arrest came amid a large-scale operation during which law enforcement conducted 47 searches at the homes of his close associates, including Horatiu Potra, who has links to Moscow's ruling circles, Romanian media reported. Weapons, ammunition, and large sums of cash were seized. Prosecutors found 900,000 euros hidden in a safe beneath the floor of Potra's home, Andrei Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, in a Telegram post.
The security of all European countries is at stake, said the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. He emphasized that Russia continues its disinformation campaigns. To counter this, Paris, Berlin, and 10 other EU countries urged the European Commission in late January 2025 to use the powers granted by the Digital Services Act to protect European elections from foreign interference, Reuters reports.
There is on our borders an overarmed and aggressive Russia. It is carrying out terrorist actions, massive disinformation campaigns at home and in Europe. If no one stops the master of the Kremlin, he will surely go to Moldova and perhaps beyond to Romania. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, in an interview with La Tribune. The return of such politicians or parties or groups inspires other anti-system forces, whether far right or far left, to begin their struggle for power. The Russian Federation might provide financial, informational, and other resources to help them come to power.
Among the right-wing politicians Moscow has already established connections with, experts point to Robert Fico and Viktor Orban. Orban, as Hungarian journalist Szabolcs Pányi reported, wrote a letter to the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, calling for the start of negotiations between the European Union and Russia over a ceasefire with Ukraine. Reported by Nikita Skoblikov, UATV News.
Thank you for your time and for having us here in American University Kiev. My first question, craving to know, mineral deal.
Yes.
Mr. Rice, do you really believe this is an actual business prospect, or this is more a thing for President Trump to show to his constituency that he has something, money is coming back from Ukraine as a sort of a repayment or whatever he thinks of?
You know, I think the devil is in the detail, and we haven't seen the details yet. And so it'll be interesting when it finally evolves. I mean, from what I understand, it's a 3-page memorandum, so it's really just a high-level agreement. But I think the important thing to remember is it was a Ukrainian idea. So this idea was brought to the United States from President Zelensky. So I think it's being pitched as if the U.S. extorted Ukraine for something. The reality is that bilateral trade agreements are very complicated. And it could appear as if, oh, wow, this is a pay-to-play. The U.S. has given all these weapons. Ukraine is paying back. The reality is most of these minerals have been identified, but they haven't been mined. There's a huge amount of capital that has to be put into mining. In order to put capital into mining, you need a very long time horizon with security guarantees, so to speak. In financial terms, it's that your capital is being put at risk and you need to have a long time, 20, 30 years to recover it. So by partnering together, I think that's a huge step forward for the Ukraine-American partnership long-term. So ideally, we will be partners politically, militarily, and economically. This is a huge economic partnership. But also, the thing that most people are forgetting is most of the minerals that are being discussed are in the occupied territories. They're completely irrelevant if Ukraine doesn't get back the occupied territories. By partnering on these, it puts them back into play in the negotiations in a big way, where our goals are aligned, the US and Ukraine, but also it identifies and captures the amount of loot that the Russians are stealing. So it was not on the discussion. Nobody was discussing this. People were talking about where the front lines would be stopped, where any ceasefire might occur. They weren't saying that, hey, wait, why are the Russians going to get to keep $500 billion of Ukrainian loot in the terms of minerals?
Right.
Now it is. I mean, this is a brilliant negotiation strategy on the idea of President Zelensky. So President Zelensky came up with this idea. It wasn't the U.S. saying, hey, give us this pay. It was, hey, the closer we are tied together economically, politically, and militarily, the better long term. Let's partner. If anybody is going to extract these minerals, let's partner with American companies and American investment firms that will then, Israel has done this incredibly well, partnering economically with the U.S. When they have a problem politically, they call Congress. Congress knows they have jobs in their district, and this is the way that democracies work. It's a combination of politics, money, and ideals. And so I think President Zelensky was genius, and I think that it came together in a record time. It was ugly, the public statements that went back and forth.
It always gets ugly there, so.
Exactly. It was unfortunate, and some of the things that were said were like shocking, but nonetheless, they seem to have gotten to a deal from what we've read. And that is a huge accomplishment in a short period of time. That just means the U.S. and Ukraine are even more tightly bound together, and that's good for Ukraine, that's good for America, and I really think it's best for Europe as a whole and NATO.
An absolutely great answer. Thank you so very much. Another question. Sure. $300 billion of, let's put it straightforward, criminal Russian assets in European banks. I know there's 5 or 10 billion in American, but it's nothing in comparison to what is in European. I even know the bank in Brussels. So, but in general, Macron said that it's not legal. It is against the law to take the money and to give it to Ukraine. Sure. Maybe, I'm asking for your speculation, a personal opinion. What do you think? Maybe it's time to change the laws.
I think everything should be on the table. I think, the Russians owe reparations and they owe damages to Ukraine. And just imagine if now there's a $500 billion deal for minerals in the east, in the occupied territories, but there's $300 billion in Russian assets. Now, if you stop the lines, you take the assets and you say it's to pay for the minerals. I think all of it's being negotiated at a really high level. I think there is a plan. We don't know it yet. Some of it's being held close to the vest. I think the new administration is coming in with a plan. And the best news is that the plan is to stop the war. The challenging news is we don't know what terms. And hopefully the terms are in favor of Ukraine and Ukraine gets to make the decision. But we don't know right now. A lot of uncertainty.
All of uncertainty, as uncertain as it gets.
Yes. But when the war started off, I was getting my doctorate in uncertainty. So I was writing my dissertation on uncertainty. So when I get that, I will be a doctor of uncertainty. So I know uncertainty. And I had to take a sabbatical in order to come here to serve. But yeah, the times are very uncertain. But there are certain things that are becoming more certain. And that's what I think when you look at the silver lining, look at the 3 years of war and how it was just going on. The U.S. was supporting Ukraine for whatever it takes, but not giving enough to win. That was dragging out. Ukraine can't survive forever just getting enough to tie.
Absolutely.
And so being bled dry, literally. And so the prior administration never had an intention, in my opinion, of winning, of helping Ukraine win. We could have given enough weapons and ammo, especially in the summer of 2022 when momentum was shifting.
Exactly.
We could have helped Ukraine do even better in the offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. We didn't. And we dragged it out. And also we didn't have the administration forcing a demand of a ceasefire. There was no pressure from the U.S. I mean, basically we all know now that the President of the United States was not mentally capable towards the end of actually leading this effort. The effort was being led by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, somebody completely unqualified to lead a war. He was not a military person. He was a Yale lawyer. Anyway, so we are where we are. But now you have an administration coming in, it's completely flipped on its head. The National Security Advisor is an amazing guy with a great military background, a Special Forces colonel and prior member of Congress, Mike Waltz. And you have a president now who's involved in every single detail. For better or worse, Donald Trump is making the decisions from the United States side. I think that's good for Ukraine. I think it's very positive that you have the dedicated effort of the number one person, probably one of the most powerful person in the world.
Let's put it straightforward, I mean, the way it is.
Also one of the most erratic. And so it's very hard to combine those two. But
maybe that's the strategy.
I believe so.
You believe so? So you believe there is a plan? Because people are asking, I mean, I've been recently talking in Munich and talking with my friends from Washington Post, from New York Post, from Time Mag. I've been asking questions, said, Donald Trump is a man of impulse. He doesn't have any plan whatsoever for Europe or for Ukraine. So maybe they were talking about out of fear, maybe because erratic things are happening now. What do you think about the plan?
I want to be clear, there are known knowns and there are unknown knowns. I do not know the plan. So I am speculating that there is a plan. I do believe there is a plan. I believe that this administration came in with a plan on multiple fronts. The southern border for the U.S., on the war in Ukraine, on the Middle East, they have a plan. Now, we always say in the military, no plan survives the first shot. So everything changes once you try to implement a plan, and especially something so complex like international relations of the highest levels of order of magnitude, the largest war in Europe in 80 years. So things are going to change. So that's where I think you see his impulse response is there's a stimulus response, boom, boom, boom. And so you're seeing the short-term communication going back and forth.
Missing the old picture.
But the big picture, I think there is a plan on how to end this war. I don't think we all know what it is. I think it'll be more evident in hindsight, and hopefully it'll be extremely positive for Ukraine. But I can say, like, look at the outcomes that are positive that have occurred just since he's become president. So you have seen Europe coalesce in a way that we hadn't seen in 3 years. They're coming together.
That much is true, right?
Which is amazing. I mean,
Absolutely.
How did he do it? How did Donald Trump get Europe
just
to coalesce
walking out of
together?
the room? That's how he did it.
He has a way of doing it. He's doing it intentionally. I think that is a very deliberate goal, and I think When President Zelensky and President Macron and President Trump met at the Notre Dame prior to the inaugural, I think they had a very good discussion about, hey, what we're going to do going forward. I think Macron is the hero. He wants to be the hero of Europe. He doesn't want to be the zero of Europe. He doesn't want to be the one that fails. He wants to be the one that brings everybody together. And I think he's leading that effort. You see him going to the U.S., talking to Trump last week. And there's tit for tat going back and forth between President Zelensky and President Trump. But President Zelensky now, 2 weeks later, is going to the United States to sign a deal for minerals that brings together the two countries in a huge way. So I think there is a plan, and I do believe that Europe did not like Donald Trump the first term. They hated him. And he said, you're not spending enough on defense. And they wouldn't spend enough on defense. Most of the European countries did not want to spend their 2%.
Right. Well.
And when he threatened to say, well, we won't defend you if you're one of the countries that not spend invest 2%, they all got rattled and they started increasing. And later on, he did say after his presidency, when he didn't know he was going to be president again, he did say afterwards, look, I wasn't going to abandon them. I had to say something to get them rattled. So he admitted that he was basically intimidating them to get them to spend because they wouldn't on their own self-interest.
Because Europe had time, 3 years, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
now they're terrified. Now they realize, wow, they could be next. Just like Ethiopia, Haile Selassie said in 1936. Today it's us, tomorrow it could be you. Yeah. Today it's Ukraine, tomorrow it could be Germany, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They're all now like, whoa, we need to increase, and they are increasing. So Donald Trump was right. Nobody likes to say yes, Donald Trump was right. It's all egos at that level, but they should say he was right back then. Now, is he right now? Time will tell. We don't know. Right. But now you see a new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, coming in, and he's saying not only 2%, we should be investing 5%. So you have a NATO Secretary General leading finally.
I hear common sense when I hear that thing. I mean, after 3 years of war, of terrible things happening in Europe, we're talking about 5%. And Americans say, well, it's 5%. Maybe you should be thinking about a little bit later because there's a wolf at the door, and we're like waiting for it to come in.
And even if the rest of Donald Trump's term in office, 3.8 years, even if everybody in Europe invested 5%, they still would not be able to build the arsenal of democracy that is America. America has far more weapons and ammo than anybody. So we're in this together. We can't pull out. We don't want to. I don't believe Trump wants to. But threatening to makes everybody increase their defense. And so it's a win-win. And so I think, I hope that America will always be with Ukraine militarily, always. And America will push to, I hope, 91 borders. And I think the real genius of a guy like Donald Trump, I think, is economics, where most presidents don't know economics at all compared to Donald Trump. And you see it in his tax plans. You see it in a lot of the things he does. He goes for the dollars, follow the money. And so you see when he comes in, all of a sudden, the economic sanctions from the EU, the strongest in 3 years just occurred this week. The strongest sanctions. Why did it wait 3 years? Because Donald Trump knows, squeeze Russia, squeeze them.
We've been talking exactly about that like 2 months ago, remember, before Trump was elected. We were thinking about what was going on, and I told you that Trump talking and walking like two different personalities. And somehow, in the end, all those crazy, erratic things that we hear and see all here and there are turning in a good way for Ukraine.
Yes.
It's crazy because starting from javelins and going on further, you can the whole. If we don't see the whole picture, we can speculate that in the end it will. But we're afraid. This is why we're saying things and my dear friend Stephen Moore told that calling unkind things. President Trump won't do the deal because he's the only game in town, and he is the only game in town for the time being. So.
Sure. Well, I do believe that America's increasing our military aid since Donald Trump has become president, and that we are increasing specifically the amount of ammunition. So Ukraine doesn't need more artillery is the #1 killer on the battlefield from both sides. Drones get all the headlines, but artillery causes the casualties, the majority
Guards
of
the
them.
wall still. Right.
Yes, and so you have two major platforms for artillery. You have an artillery tube, and there's a lot of 155 millimeter types. There's British, there's French, there's Swedish, there's American. Right. But you also have HIMARS launchers. You don't need any more artillery tubes or launchers. What you need is more artillery rounds, artillery shells, and rockets and missiles. And that's what you're getting. And those are going to increase. So You've seen Russian casualties. The first 10 months of the war were roughly 5,000 a month. Now they're up to 45,000, 48,000 a month. These are massive Russian casualties, and it's mostly through cluster munitions. And now we're increasing our cluster munitions deployments, so you're getting more and more shells. So your guns are going to be taking out more lethality on the Russians, and you're going to see more and more Russians die. And so that hurts people's ears sometimes when they're not a military professional, but not here in
I've been in
Ukraine.
Bucha, I've seen a pit in the ground full of dead bodies, so nothing going to hurt my feelings.
So ideally we increase, Ukraine Armed Forces gets to increase Russian casualties 60,000, 70,000 a month. There is a point at which is not sustainable, but you do that simultaneously with the economic pressure and with the political pressure all together. And so Trump has Europe coalescing on the political and the economic pressure. Now the U.S. needs to be able to supply Ukraine Armed Forces with enough to really go through militarily. And Europe is actually supplying a lot of combat power too. I mean, you're seeing more fighters come from Europe. They're all from Europe, and so you're seeing a lot more combat power coming from Europe, and that's good for Ukraine. And
coming from Europe, sent by Donald Trump. Because
with pressure,
exactly
with pressure. Yes, and I think they're stepping up. They're finally stepping up. I don't believe it's in Ukraine's interest. I think they're stepping up in their own self-interest because they're starting to realize, wow, if Ukraine falls, Russia's going to keep going.
I mean, good. We're in Ukraine. We're not saying anything.
Exactly.
We've been saying this for 3 years in a row. Zelensky been telling it to everyone in Europe that, guys, this is your war.
Yeah.
And now they're starting to realize when Donald Trump said, I'm just walking out of the room. So,
and then the question is where the ceasefire is and then how you're going to man the border to protect, to make sure that it's a security guarantee that is not, you can never have foolproof, but that is secure and confident, because you can't have capital come into Ukraine to invest in the mining operations and expanding all of the economic footprint without real security, long-term security. And so in my opinion, the NATO countries will all discuss having troops on the border. Trump is saying he won't put U.S. troops on the border. In the end, they're going to have a negotiation. I think it'll end up being in the self-interest of all of the European countries.
Some deterrence force?
No, I don't think you'll ever see an Italian, Czech force on the border without the NATO umbrella. They won't stick their troops out there because they're terrified of the Russian army and they don't want to be in the position that the Ukrainian army is against the Russians. They will not end up doing it unless it's covered by NATO and has all the NATO umbrella, including the U.S. air power. So I think the argument to admit Ukraine to NATO is going to become more and more powerful. And I think Donald Trump is trying to get the Europeans to beg him to get U.S. approval for it. Because right now you have Germany, you have Slovakia, you have a number of countries that will vote against it. But I think Macron is going to lead the Europeans to say, we need Ukraine post-war to be part of NATO. And that's the dream. I mean, if that can happen, that would be Nobel Peace Prize if Donald Trump can do that.
Last question in this interview. A ceasefire, I've heard these voices that said, in case of any ceasefire, Ukraine is not in NATO, but if Russians will attack again, then NATO is like sort of a collateral to the deal, and then NATO steps in and Ukraine gets its place in NATO. Do you believe this is a viable idea?
You know, I think that would be a good solution, but I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think NATO will ever agree to terms like that without having the full NATO vote that an attack on one is an attack on all. So I think it has to be a NATO membership. I don't think you can put troops on the border.
It's like nothing in the middle, right?
I can't imagine, but you never know. That's what the challenge here is, to find a solution that both provides long-term security for Ukraine, that they can't come back. And, you know, that's why I think, you know, Ukraine, you know, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum is obviously, it shouldn't have given up the nukes, and now wants them, is requesting them, is not going to get them. But how do you ensure that the Russians don't come back? I mean, there are other ways that, you know, the U.S. could provide such firepower like Tomahawks.
Exactly.
You know, we provide 50 Tomahawk missiles and say, hey, the Black Sea Fleet is going to be sunk the moment you cross the border, because, you know, 1/3 of the Black Sea Fleet has been amazingly sunk by Ukraine. But there's still 2/3 out there. And they could all be sunk. We know where they are from satellites. They could be sunk in 10 minutes with the right number of Tomahawks. And so we could arm Ukraine like a porcupine and say, okay, we're going to give Ukraine enough now to make sure this never happens again, which we should have done, frankly, before 2014, but even after 2014, we certainly should have increased lethal military aid to make sure there was never a full-scale invasion. I mean, how that didn't even occur, how it wasn't even discussed in the U.S. doesn't make sense to me. Putin violated the sovereignty of Ukraine in 2014 by invading the Donbass and Crimea. He should have been told that, hey, we're putting in a border here. We don't care what your vote is. We're going to give lethal aid, javelins, stingers. You know, Obama wouldn't do it, and it took to get to President Trump to give that lethal aid under Mike Pompeo. And finally, Ukraine got some lethal aid, really good lethal aid from the United States. Wasn't in the volume needed, but it was enough to help, barely to help the defense of Kyiv. Hindsight's 2020. I think now, going into this, we should be prepared to give significantly more weapons that Ukraine can use as a porcupine defense to make sure that it never, ever sees a Russian invasion.
Porcupine defense. Yes. I just love the term. Thank you so very much, Dan. Again, it's an exquisite pleasure. Your knowledge in military and political scenery and things is just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for visiting us again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
The world is witnessing a seismic shift. The United States, once the bedrock of European security, has frozen military aid to Ukraine, now officially. And it sends shockwaves through Kyiv, Brussels, London, Paris and beyond. Timothy Ash, a leading expert in European security and a guest at our wrap-up episodes, has called it a staggering, extraordinary and on the scale of the Soviet Union's collapse. And he might not be wrong, with President Trump's pivot toward Moscow, NATO's reliability is now under serious question, and the European leaders are scrambling to fill in this security void led by Washington now. So what does this mean for Ukraine, for Europe and for the global balance of power at all? This is Pavlo Shtelmach for the Daily Wrap-Up. Let's go. First, for Ukraine, this decision is nothing short of an existential threat. US aid has been the backbone of Ukraine's military for many years, and the ability to resist Russian aggression. With that support now in turmoil and limbo, Kyiv faces the very risk of running low on ammunition, air defense missiles for Patriots, which is really important, and intelligence data, which allows Ukraine to strike deep into the Russian frontline bases and even rear. And heavy weaponry at a critical time on the battlefield might run low too. Let's be clear, the fight for Ukraine's survival has never been easy, and it has never been just about Ukraine. It's about the security of Europe, the strength of the NATO alliance, and the future of the global order at all. If US aid remains frozen for a long time, it could accelerate Russian advances on the front line, push Ukraine's military back, and force Kyiv into negotiations on Moscow's terms, which basically mean capitulation. Their demands, so-called denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, are nothing new and nothing more than calls for regime change and permanent subjugation. They are preparing for total victory right now. But despite the setbacks, Ukraine is still standing, and Europe may finally be realizing that its security depends on Ukraine's survival now. As of now, all military aid flow to Ukraine is frozen from the US, and even intelligence data are in question. These data are crucial for Ukrainians to strike Russian headquarters and bases all over the front and in the rear, which is really important. And for decades, Europe has depended on the United States for security. NATO. It is an alliance led by Washington. It has been the ultimate guarantee of protection, but that dynamic is shifting. With Trump openly questioning US commitments, European leaders are being forced to reconsider their long-term defense strategies already at this moment. Is this good news? Some European nations are stepping up. And a recent poll in France shows that 2/3 of French citizens support either manufacturing, maintaining or increasing assistance to Ukraine. French President Macron has also floated the idea of sending European peacekeepers to Ukraine once hostilities end. But will that be enough? Europe still faces a massive challenge in closing the military gap left by America's potential withdrawal. Years of underinvestment have left European arsenals depleted. Even though leaders in Berlin, Paris and London are ramping up defense spending now, military rebuilding stockpiles and manufacturing enough weapons to replace US will take years, if not decades. In the meantime, Ukraine needs immediate support. The coming months will test whether European powers can mobilize fast enough to prevent a disaster on their doorstep, and European leaders seem to understand the entire urgency of the security situation. All eyes are on France and the UK now, but never can we count out Germany, and their winning parties in the election have recently developed a common ground on rebuilding and reinvesting in the military infrastructure of the country. And Trump's decision doesn't just affect Ukraine, it is redefining